everyone. My name is Ashley, and welcome to the virtual launch of Tamar Rubin's book, Tablet Fragments. Before we begin, I would first like to acknowledge that we are live streaming from Treaty 1 territory, where we live and work on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'm just going to go through a quick couple of housekeeping notes. If you experience any issues during the live stream, try refreshing the page. That usually sorts out any issues that you may be experiencing with Facebook Live events. A recording of the live stream will also be made available on both the Signature Editions Facebook page and a YouTube page after the event, so you can always catch anything you may have missed there. And there are links to purchase copies of both Tablet Fragments and Fields of Light and Stone, and those links are pinned both in the comments as well as the description for the live event. I would now like to introduce Lori Cayer, who is our host for this evening. Lori has written 4 books of poetry: Stealing Mercury, Attenuations of Force, Dopamine Blunder, and most recently, Mrs. Romanov. She lives at the edge of Winnipeg, where the city meets the prairie. And our first reader and guest is Angeline Schellenberg. Angeline has published 4 poetry chapbooks and 2 full-length collections, Tell Them It Was Mozart and Fields of Light and Stone, which she will be reading from tonight. She is the mom of 2 emerging adults. And finally, our guest of honor is Tamar Rubin. Tamar is a physician, a mother of 2, and a poet from Winnipeg, Manitoba. Tablet Fragments is her first book of poetry. Welcome, everyone, and I'm now going to hand everything over to Lori.
So hello to everyone out there in the invisible audience, and hello to Angeline and to Tamar, and welcome to Tamar's book launch. Tamar, your book is lovely. Right from the cover, right and through to the Hebrew text that's found all throughout the pages. The poems are frank and open, but they delve deep. There are footnotes, there's a glossary, which is nothing but added value for the poetry nerd in me and perhaps in a lot of the readers. When I was comparing and contrasting your 2 books, Angeline and Tamar, I was at first really struck that they were very, very different books. And before long, before I was even halfway through each of them, I began to realize that there was just a huge breadth of similarities between the books. So many similarities, in fact, I started making lists. So forgive me, I'm going to read a little bit from my lists here. Both of your books are very personal, and the personal story that you're telling is very much embedded in your narratives of family history, exodus and home, culture, and emotional legacy. You have so many poems that mirror each other. You both have poems about museums, berries, lakes, trees, not even counting family. And amongst the trees, you both have poems about aspens. And such a strange coincidence, you both have poems about aspens after forest fire. I absolutely loved that you had that congruency without even realizing it. Each of your books has key poems that are written from the point of view of others. For Angeline, it's her grandparents' love letters. And for Tamar, it's your Moses on the mountain. But what I felt was really your strongest point of congruence that you shared was the undercurrent, or actually more of an overcurrent, of religion that defines both of your backgrounds. I was wondering if you would both like to read the poems you've chosen to start us off this evening. Angeline first.
Thanks, Lori, and thank you, Signature Editions and Tamar, for inviting me to be here. Yeah, one of the most unique parts about my book is that I had access to my grandparents' love letters, and All four of my grandparents were very dedicated to the church, and the grandparents on this side of the family that the love letters are from, he was a pastor, and he was a conscientious objector during the First World War. So I'm going to read one of these love letters that I've created by excerpting their words. And so the voice on the left is my grandpa, and on the right is my grandma. I have struggles which were unknown to me in earlier Christian life. December is certainly giving us a taste of something better than November, which was so dull and misty. I'll write him that the Lord's way is not quite clear to me as yet. Seldom, if ever, did we get a glimpse of the sun. Perhaps the expiration of the war may be the decisive factor. But Abe, should the Lord so lead our path into his vineyard, even in the rough and hard places, as you write of yourself, I needs must say of myself, what a comfort to know he goes before. I feel incapable, a road that seems so dark.
Thank you. I love the fragments that poem is made up of. And Tamar?
So I'm going to read from my poem, Plague of the Firstborn. And this is a poem that is set at the Passover table at the Seder, which is the traditional ceremonial meal. And there's a lot of traditions, and some of them I describe in this semi-fictional, semi-narrative story about the Passover Seder. 10 plagues trailed me out of Egypt into adulthood, through stubborn history, my mother, exegesis remembered poorly. Wherever I wandered, like a hungry animal, these stories dogged me. Miracles followed. Once a year, we sat together, all of us returned from Exodus. At Passover, we shared a meal, swore it would be the last, then served up more grievances, each convinced she'd been a slave. Our discord released another Nile between us. We read curses to each other, solemnly, drowned out compassion with ritual. We followed protocol, removing wine, reducing pleasure, the sound of forks on glass like tiny hailstones. Our dinner plates became battlegrounds, 10 red blemishes splattered round the edges. Darkness settled, the adult firstborn children, full of bitter herbs, still waited for the youngest to ask 4 questions. We repeated stories, bled together sweet wine, afflictions I can't remember. We sang, maybe next year, in Jerusalem. My voice a version of my mother's, irritating, the same old blisters, while around the table new ones formed.
Thank you. So let's talk a bit about writing process. When we finished writing a book of poetry, which can take years, and then when we finished editing a book of poetry, which can take months, there remains a lot of questions regarding layout and design of the book. A lot of things about the interior. That's where your Hebrew comes in, Tamar, and different sorts of found poems you might place out in a certain way. However, the cover art and the title often have most resonance for the poet. It's a very, very important set of selections. The title can sometimes come from the content, and cover art often has very personal meaning. Can I ask both of you to talk a bit about your covers and how you arrived at them both?
Sure. So the cover image on my book is Last Embrace by Miriam Rudolph. And it's ever since some of my favorite writers like Dora Duick and Mira Cook had Miriam Rudolph's cover artwork on their covers. I loved her work, and I really wanted this image for these poems. And I'm so glad that she agreed to give us permission to use this. It's a self-portrait of her with a figure who represents all the people she left behind when she immigrated from Paraguay to Canada. So it's also an immigration story. I love the trees, which are repeated on the title pages inside the book. The original title I thought of for the book was What the Aspens Whispered. The current title is Fields of Light and Stone. That came from two of the villages that my paternal grandparents were born in, Lichfeld and Steinfeld, which could be translated Field of Light and Field of Stone. There are two villages in the Molochna Mennonite colony in Ukraine. And I also like, I see another meaning in it too, that light in a field can either make things grow or it can scorch them. And stones in a field can either block things from growing, or they can be a place to stand and get a higher view of the land. And I think there's both positive and negative things to the legacy that I received from my family. So I will read the title poem. Fields. She was born in a field of light. He was born in a field of stone. They found themselves in the strait of the spirit. They found each other in the dark. In the field of light and the field of stone, not one stone remains on another. In the strait of the spirit, he turned over the fields that once fed buffalo. She turned over the fields to their unyielding sons. The nurses turned out the light.
Thank you. And Tamar?
Thanks so much, Angeline. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my title and my cover. So the cover is actually a watercolor that my mom, who's a visual artist, painted. And I thought that this series really reflected the content of my book. And I chose a number of them. I like how the paint overlaps each other, and it sort of looks like there's multiple layers, and there's a lot of space in the cover that sort of, to me, reflects the concept of tablet fragment, of a sort of broken vessel that's still whole and that you can kind of see through in different places. Now, the title, Tablet Fragments, probably could have multiple meanings, and it actually comes from one of my favorite stories from the Bible, the story where Moses goes up Mount Sinai to receive the divine revelation, and he gets the stone tablets, and when he comes down, he sees the children of Israel in this huge betrayal, and he, in anger and confusion, throws down the tablets, and they shatter into a million pieces. And he asks for a second chance and goes back up and gets a new set of tablets. And when he comes back down, instead of discarding the old tablets, the Levites actually collect all the broken fragments and place them in the Ark of the Covenant next to the whole fragments. And I'm just going to read the last part of the prologue, which sort of goes through that famous story and sort of explains a little bit about some of the interpretation of that act of collecting the fragments. The Kabbalah teaches that the Ark is a symbol of the human heart, and that brokenness, of the stamped-on glass when the bride and groom stand under the wedding canopy, of the created world when the divine light shatters its earthly vessels, is an essential aspect of the wholeness of life. And Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotzik says, there is nothing more whole than a broken heart. So I'm going to read now from the eponymous poem, Tablet Fragments. And before I read it, I'm just going to explain the Hebrew letters that are part of the poem and that I've chosen to include in this poem. They're the first 10 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and correspond with the lettering in the 10 Commandments. Aleph. Moses discovers adultery, breaks dishes. Shame is a ragged edge that grips. Something with traction, loved, hated, that left. A hot, sticky mess, cooled, charred, sacred, you're not sure which, in what measure. Shame is the remnant of anger. It sticks by the broken ends of shattered tablets, still pointed, dangerous as knives in butter. Shame is fatter than treachery that slaughtered the golden calf, smashed stones into fragments you could scatter, now lingers, terrifying in your hands. Bet. After Sinai. I promised I'd never skip away a perfect stone, but then I found one, had to test its will to dance above water. The arguments weighed on me. If I didn't drop something, I thought I might drown. I threw the tablets in, a reckless fling that missed the real thrust. I wasn't. Stone would never be water. Gimel. The pieces are a reminder. I couldn't leave commandments where I broke them. I packed my rucksack full of thirsty crusts, wandered through the parchment desert as a fraction. I moved each lifeless fragment out of honor for the body or to bury the bones of evidence later. Daled. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi instructs us, take the broken with us. I gathered up the sacred stones, the tiny mass of every atom, adding up but never reproducing whole. I kept the parts, although they had no function for anyone anymore. Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud, except for me, so I could hold them.
Thank you, Tamar. I was thinking of something else about your cover and the way the colors are all swirled, and they are almost like fragments of color to me that reflects the word fragments in your title, and they seem almost to me like paint that has been suspended in water just at that moment before it all blends together. And also, forgive me, I had a very strange question to ask you. The first time I saw your book, before I opened it, before I knew what it was about, I saw the title was Tablet Fragments. And the first thought that popped into my head was, oh, that must be a busy person, a busy poet who has written this book in fits and starts and in fragments on a computer tablet. Do you think that's in any way a fit metaphor or interpretation of your title?
Hi, Lori. That's a funny question. I think just reflects the times that we're in. So the first thing that comes to your mind is a tablet, and here I am going back to biblical times and writing something about a very old story. In a way, I think that that metaphor can have multiple meanings. And I actually, one of the poems that I'm going to read tonight, the original title for it was Tablet Fragments, and it was basically about the postpartum experience. And I was thinking of it more as tablets, like pills and that type of thing. Right. But I in all to be honest, I did write a lot of this book in bits and pieces. It was a process that took a decade, and a lot of the poems started out as a few sentences on my iPhone, which is, a tablet equivalent, or makes, our tablets of modern times. So it did come together in pieces like that. And, just to delve further into that metaphor, I think I see a lot of the stories that I tell through my poems as tablets, as parts and pieces of different lives that I've lived over time.
And fragments of those lives too, because you can't ever tell everything. That's the beauty of poetry, is that it breaks everything apart.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, you're beginning the answer already of my next question, which is about the way each of you manages your writing life, really. Are you very disciplined writers who have a set time of day to write, and you write every day, and your entire schedule is about making sure that dedicated writing time happens? Or are you the kind of writer whose writing flows, ebbs and flows with day-to-day life over the course of your lifetime? And parenting is another one of those things where, that parenting is an ever-changing thing. And so therefore that would have an ever-changing effect on your time to write and how you write. How do you manage to do everything? How do you do it all?
I didn't write when I was in school or when I had little kids. I wrote my first book, Till Then It Was Mozart, about my kids when I was kind of in the thick of their elementary school difficulties. And it was a good outlet for processing that. I've been writing poetry seriously for almost a decade. And for most of that time, I was working part-time in an office, and I was pretty disciplined about writing on my days off and on weekends. And I was just laid off this year. And at the beginning of the year before COVID, I would write while everyone was away at school or work. Right. But I've had people in my space for the last 6 months. So I'm still writing a lot. It's just not as scheduled. I found some online writing groups that have writing prompts, and I find that very helpful. I start writing in my notebook, and then I'll transfer it onto my computer. And I write best in the summer. I need sun. And I like the lack of routine and busyness. So we built a patio, and that's kind of been my office lately.
Right. It was a good hot summer for that.
Yeah, I like hot.
How about you, Tamar? What kind of writer are you?
So I think that's fluctuated over time and taken on different forms. So I like to think I'm a disciplined writer in the sense that just like anything else, like exercise or reading fiction, you kind of have to carve out time and commit yourself to it, or it won't happen. That's had to shift a little bit. I have a 4.5-month-old and a 2-year-old or almost 2-year-old at the moment, so they keep me pretty busy. I did edit this book while in the first 6 months of my older son Samuel's life. So that was actually a good time for me because he was sort of took lots of naps, and I used those nap times to write. And in terms of balancing parenting with writing, I find a lot of times the best time for me is at 4 a.m. when I've been woken up and can't get back to sleep. Right. But balancing that with a full-time career as a physician, trying to keep up with that and parenting and writing, I find that I'm just juggling. And so I go from really focusing hard on one thing and then balancing that out with focusing on the other. So after Samuel was born, I spent a lot of time working on this book. But since that time, I've had, focused on my career, and then now focusing on a toddler. So it is hard to find time to write. And I don't think one can ever really do it all. You kind of decide on, or at least in my case, it seems you decide on the kinds of things you want to do and then give each of them a turn when it's their turn.
Right. And something like a book comes along and then it absorbs a good chunk of a year for you. And then that passes and then you work towards the next book.
Right.
One thing I find quite ironic about studying medicine, at least in the West, is that we expect our practitioners to be at their 100% best and most alert. But oddly, it is the study of medicine that that seeks to have extreme sleep deprivation actually be part of the program. You know, it's almost like some kind of psychological test. So I was just, wondering sort of the same question about med school. Were you writing poetry before you went to med school? Were you able to write poetry during med school?
So I definitely I probably started writing in elementary school. I mean, I think if I read some of those, they would, they were rhyming poems and whatnot. And I wrote all the way through med school.
Wow.
I think in some ways, I mean, the reason for all the sleep deprivation, the nights on call, is just to see enough of the unusual presentations, things that come along at night, and then also that balance of service, and residents sort of play a role in keeping the hospital running at odd hours of the night. But once you finish, you get to enjoy a little bit more sleep. I think it was good preparation for parenting, which, to be completely honest, I think is a lot more demanding than even all those crazy nights on call.
Oh, wow.
But I think just like in my life now, I was sort of balancing, time to write with, deciding if I needed to nap or study or do all the other kinds of things that I wanted to be doing.
I'm certainly impressed that you managed to keep the juggling ball of poetry aloft during all of that. I've asked you guys to each pick a poem to read that would illustrate what we've just talked about. Did you want to go ahead with yours, Angeline?
Sure. This poem is about the one grandparent whom I was with when she died. And I was struck by how many similarities there were in intensity and focus between ushering her out of the world and ushering my son in. So it's called Deep Breathing. The day, squeezing my husband's thumb till it throbbed. How long since we've slept? The circle of nurses tightens around me, urging, push, push, more, push, push, again, more. Don't you want to see your baby? Focus on breathing. Slow in, slow out. He's here. The night. My hand on Grandma's heavy arm, feeling for pulse. Doesn't she look asleep? Aunts and cousins ring the bed, chanting, "You're free, you can go. We love you, you can go." Do you see the angels? Focus on breathing. Nothing in, nothing out. She's gone.
That poem gives me chills. And Tamar, yours is a different flavor altogether.
Yeah, so this one is called Postpartum To-Do List. Flesh out blank thank you cards. Quell milk leak. Open wet paperback, 30 pages in. Wake up, inner mother. Grow to love expanded belly. Ask mom to water dying plants. Google rooting, reflex, relentless crying, the Get Your Body Back manual. Translate colic. Rename sex, the birth canal. Reminders, losing self is normal. So is perpetual nightgown, circadian refusal. Day sweats, drenching months. Take medicine on empty stomach. Keep out of direct sunlight. Do not remove the blackened remnant of closing holes. Do not despair. Do not panic. If fear clots like thrush or bloodstains form the name of my ex. Follow the curdled formula trail. Rorschach coffee drips will lead me to a better phase.
Thank you. What I really like, both of those choices of poems, they give such a completely different view of parenting. But what I also quite liked is that they're quite indicative of the differences in your two styles, I think. They make a very good example of that.
Which is funny because I almost didn't include that poem.
Oh, really? That's
I
love that poem.
I only started liking it after it was in the book, and I read it for the first time at an online reading and saw people's reactions, and I realized, oh, maybe it is a good poem, and now I really like it.
Oh yeah, it really is, absolutely.
And I love the way that poem that Tamar just read is like, it does what she said about the tablet fragments. It carries all the broken pieces.
It sure does. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And Tamar, back to talking about your writing life. I know that you don't like to talk about your job in your writing life or your writing life at your job. I know you like to keep a solid separation between the two, but I was wondering if you might care to expand at all on your reasons. Because your poems do, in fact, you do have medical poems in your book, a number of them. And of course, they're amongst my favorite of all the poems in that. You have poems of medical concepts and experiences that you've had, but you don't write them in a technical way. You use them as metaphors, it seems to me, for a larger story that you're telling. I would definitely describe you as a poet who is also a physician, rather than a physician who finds their art from their profession. How do you work out this balance of how much to include of your work life in your creative life?
Thanks, Lori. I guess it's not fully true that my two lives are completely separate. I think in studying medicine, I was taught and learned a completely new language, and that language makes up the language that I use to write, just like the language, the Hebrew language that I learned in my Jewish education also informs my writing. So too does that medical language. And you're right in saying that I don't always just write about medical experiences as, a physician seeing patients, but sometimes trying to use some of the universal experiences or the medical language to delve into the personal. And a lot of my poems, has been pointed out, are deeply personal poems. And so in part for that reason, just like, I don't necessarily want to become friends with my patients on Facebook. I don't necessarily want my patients who see me for their personal medical problems to read about my personal life in such great detail. That being said, of course, this is all an art, so it's not exactly, nonfiction where it's a completely accurate depiction of my life. And so without that context, I sort of fear that someone could read it and make assumptions that aren't necessarily true.
Your poems are not case studies. They're not
absolutely
written way.
Yeah, and of course the other thing, the same way that I write about medical content, but not necessarily about certainly not about any specific patients or things that could be identified from the medical perspective.
They're interesting concepts too. In particular, I really liked the blue roses. That's such a beautiful image.
Yeah.
What is used to describe some deadly cells when you see them on a microscope slide.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting besides being very beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah. So Lori's referring to one of my poems about called Bone China, about a type of childhood cancer where the cells under the microscope are described as looking like blue rosettes. And I just thought, I remember learning about that in medical school and thinking, just like we were talking about tablet fragments, that was something I jotted down in my iPhone or my notepad, because I thought, how beautiful that something so horrible could, look like these flowers. And when you prepare slides from a biopsy, you sort of spread them out on this thin plate of glass, and thinking about these blue flowers on the glass, it reminded me of fancy china. And so I wrote a poem about that. And those types of moments I find often strike me, whether at work or day to day. And sometimes a poem will come out of that. So I am lucky in my profession to be told every day, multiple different stories, hear different perspectives, see the world in a particular way, often with beautiful images, even X-rays and MRIs and those types of things often are very visually stunning and interesting. And so if I sometimes take off my medical hat and just think about that from the perspective of a person, it's just so interesting and cool, and such an amazing source of creative content as well.
When we talked the other day, you said something about imposter syndrome as well.
Yeah, so that's another interesting thing. So you mentioned, I'm flattered that you think of me as a poet who's also a physician, because I think, one thing about medicine is you get a degree, you do a certain prescribed training, and then people call you a doctor and assume that you're a doctor. There isn't any such certification to become a poet. And I think that's always been hard for me. I kind of always feel like an imposter saying I'm a poet. Who gave me permission to call myself a poet? That being said, I sometimes feel that way in my job as a doctor. And I think that's, always feeling like I don't know enough, and I understand from reading about this is a common sentiment, sometimes attributed in particular to female physicians not having the confidence or the security to feel like they're, a full-fledged doctor, that, they don't know enough, or that they're just faking it. But yeah, that's certainly something that I've struggled with as a poet. Just I feel a little bit now that I have a book that I can say, okay, I'm a poet now.
Yes,
but until then,
your first book is your definite diploma that you
yeah,
if you thought you weren't before.
Mm-hmm.
So I picked a poem for you to read, and I do love this poem. I love a good list poem, and this one in particular, to me, puts the reality to becoming a doctor, what you probably really went through, because we lay people, often think that medicine, like certain professions, are very high-minded, but you describe this poem as the nitty-gritty day-to-day, and I love this poem. I'd like you to read it, please.
So here I am reading another list poem, but I will say one thing before I start. The word patience and patience, two different things that I deal with in my day-to-day work, are spelled differently. And so you'll have to decide when I'm saying which one, even as I try my best to pronounce these words properly. What I lost in becoming a doctor. Patience, patience, patience. Every morning a lot, shock, 7/4, patience, being human, loose change clattering in my cranium, brain working for me, blissful ignorance, trust in Western medicine, beauty rest, romantic underemployment, 164 nights, a real intense kind of giving a shit, disgust, time with loved ones, coffee, cafeteria eggs, every kind of perishable food item and indoor plant, 200 pens, surprise, confidence, quiet, a few minor characters I needed for the second half of my first novel.
Wonderful, thank you. Both of you, in your books, explore deeply personal family mythologies. Can you talk a bit about your views on writing about other people, in particular family, children, partners, and even ex-partners who you may or may not want to consult? Who owns these stories? Who has a right to tell them? How do you feel about telling the stories of others?
I was nervous about the reaction to both of my books. The first one about my kids and this one about my grandparents. My kids were fine with me writing about them when they were younger. They at my first book launch, my daughter turned around to the audience as I was reading a poem about her and went, "It's about me." But I don't write about them the same way now, or hardly at all, because they're 18 and 21, and I feel like their stories as adults are their own to tell. And I don't really publish things about my parents, who are still here. If my grandparents were still here, I wouldn't have written this book because it's about grieving them, and I don't think they would have let me read their love letters while they were here, but I'm so glad that I was able to read them after they were gone. I feel a little weird, like they're, I think they've forgiven me, but it did feel very intimate reading their love letters. And I was nervous about how the rest of the extended family might feel about me talking about their parents, aunts and uncles. But when I gave my parents this book, they phoned me and said, "Whose daughter are you?" But they weren't disowning me, because the next thing they said was, "Where'd you learn to write like this? Not from us." So they approved.
So you got the thumbs up.
Yeah, but I realized as I was telling my aunt and uncle about one of the poems that this is just my perspective, because memory is so faulty. I was reading a poem in the book about this old church where my grandpa first pastored, and it was on the farmyard, and they turned that church into grain storage. And I thought it was a white church with a stairway to a little office balcony, and it was a red brick church, and there was no stairway anywhere. So the church in my mind and in my poem is not the actual historical church.
Right.
So who knows how many other things are just my take on my grandparents, and I've kind of created this mythology about who they are that isn't actually the people that anybody else knew.
Yeah, the scientists seem to be fairly sure that memory is very fallible to the point of being almost useless. So it does make me rather nervous to think about that.
Useful for writing poetry, though.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, so obviously this is a complicated question. Lots of people have written novels where people wonder if they are one of the characters, or books of poetry about people. I think I want to kind of pick up on what Angeline was saying, which is that this is a creative work. This is not necessarily a direct narrative, the story of my life or the story of anyone's life, really. This is sort of feelings and emotions that have taken the form of a story, which may or may not be a real story, but come from a place of authenticity and lived experience not necessarily a real one. And just the same way that some of the medical poems come in that way. So I feel that even though, I sometimes see disclaimers like events depicted in this book may or may not reflect the lives of real people. And while I will acknowledge that, in my book here, I'm writing about my life and experiences, the I is not always I. The details of the characters are sometimes true, sometimes not. And it's not really about figuring out which ones are true and which one aren't, but there's a feeling that comes from, or I hope that comes from reading the poems, and that as the reader goes through it, they kind of get a picture or a story and a feeling that they leave with. So that's maybe a little bit of a complicated answer to that complicated question.
Answer. It's a great answer. Because nobody really, there wouldn't be a lot of writing out there if we were all being limited by what others in advance, what others would or would not want us to write down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, sometimes this may be true in this book and in other experiences. Sometimes you have to ask for permission, or it's easier to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. So I wrote about my experiences, and, it actually sometimes people aren't happy with what you've written about them or what they perceive that you've written about them. And of course, my intents are never to cause anyone any kind of harm or emotional pain. But these are, I feel compelled in my writing. So you're asking about the process of writing. For me, whether or not I am disciplined about it to write an hour each day, or it just comes naturally, I just have to write. And so I am going to write no matter what. And that's true for these poems in this book.
And the three of us talked also the other day about how mostly we don't hear from people who were upset about having been mentioned or depicted in a certain way. And we wondered if either they weren't unhappy about it, or they were unhappy about it and they just didn't say anything, or there might even be cases where maybe they didn't even read it. And we'll never know, right? So all's fair in the writing of books, all kinds of books. Another part of planning. I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, when Tamar says she has to write, that is so true, because when we worked together in the Sheldon Oberman mentorship program, I just couldn't keep up with her. She was giving me new poems and revisions of those poems constantly. She's a force to be reckoned with.
I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it. I think you were probably a really good student on that account too.
Well, I had a very good teacher and a very good mentor, and I really am thankful for the Sheldon Oberman mentorship program, which was really, I think, even though I say the book was my transition to feeling like a professional writer, I think being part of that and working on a manuscript during that time was really what, for me, felt like that change.
Right.
I think the learning was mutual, but I think, the main thing I wanted to teach her was, yes, you're a poet.
Well, just as a sort of last thing, I wanted to talk a little bit about the opening and closing poems of the book. We talked a lot about the layout and design and the way you would plan out your book. And a thing that's extremely important for the writer is those two bookending poems for their book. They can be a continuation of the book. They can be complete standalone poems that speak for themselves, or they can summarize the book, offer another layer, that sort of thing. Can you each talk a little bit about your opening and closing poems? But then I'll ask you each to read the last poem in the book.
Sure. Yeah, I'm smiling and nodding because this is one of my things I really like about my book. And it's because it was my editor at University of Alberta Press, Alice Major, who had the idea to put the two poems about aspens at the front and the back. And they're kind of like a shelter belt around the other poems. I don't know if there's anything else to say about it, but I'll just read the last poem. The first trees. Aspens are the first trees to recover, to spread after all life has been cut down or burned away, their shared roots resting below the heat of greed and betrayal, their sibilant leaves turning gold in unison, like the veering of swallows. The weightiest living thing on earth is an aspen stand, 47,000 trunks strong. Tens of thousands of years before flight, Pando began like all seeds, with an idea, and the soil caught wind of it. Lighter than oak or regret, aspen crates are perfect for carrying the books our ancestors have yet to write.
Thank you.
So I'm going to read my last poem. And just to talk about the first and last poem in my book, they do relate to each other. My book does, like I said, tells a story, but the story isn't really a direct linear narrative arc. Instead, it's sort of a winding pathway, and it's a winding pathway moving between fragments and stories, learning to live with fragments and carrying fragments alongside a whole. And so, some poems are darker, some poems are more optimistic, and I do end on what I think is an optimistic note. And I think that's sort of key in understanding this book. The first poem is a bit of an external landscape of my life, and then the last poem is more of an internal architecture, and sort of coming to terms with those pieces and seeing them in a different way. So this is called Wedding Ceremony for Body Parts. Good night, cheeks. Good night, neck. Good night, fingers, wrists, legs. Good night, arms, and good night, chest. Good night, dry clean only dress. Hello, body grown from mother's milk to stretch marked breasts. Welcome, weight of celebrating, soft upper thigh and spreading flesh. Hasta la vista, former being. Hello, fears, cord of thickened veins. Hello, longing for the discontinued beta self. Bless you, body, like my mother, bless new clothes. In English Hebrew, honey, titchadshi. Bless me, mother, child, partner. Bless the broken bits that make me whole. Bless each elbow. Bless the image of my mother, losing her accent, almost forgetting Safta. Bless the nucleus in Yemen, the house of brown-skinned women in Canada. Hello, reflection. Hello, perfect imperfection. This woman is ready now for marriage.
When you finished reading that poem, or as you were reading it, it reminded me that, and I wanted to actually ask you this, and I hadn't thought of it, but I noticed quite a lot of sneaky little rhymes throughout your book. And I've wondered, because the rhymes were not sustained over whole poems, but they did appear in little spots. And I wanted to ask you about that. Did you, do you resist the urge? Do rhymes just kind of happen and you decide whether or not you're going to leave them there? Rhyme is a thing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I certainly have, in this book, there aren't poems with a definite rhyming scheme or
Right.
consistent rhyming scheme. It's more free verse. I think I just love the sound of words, the sound of language. And yeah, sometimes that kind of comes out as rhymes and internal rhymes.
Internal rhymes in particular.
And I do tend to keep them if I think that they work.
Right.
I try not to force them. And so, and sometimes I will remove it if it, takes away from the whole rhythm and flow of the piece. But yeah, I think it sort of they just appear.
Wow, that was, yeah, I quite like those little rhymey bits here and there. And another thing you said earlier that struck me was that I keep assigning you, when I'm suggesting poems for you to read, I seem to be assigning you the list poems. So I wanted to maybe ask each of you, because we sort of came to the decision of which poems you would read, either because I wanted them or you wanted them to fit, what we were talking about. But do each of you have a very favorite poem in the book that you'd like to read? You might have to go flipping through your pages to answer this question, but
I don't think I do.
No?
I think I'm pretty happy with the whole darn thing.
Yeah. Okay, so if someone asked you, pick one poem to read, which poem would you pick? Or is that something that it depends on the day, how you might feel?
I write whole collections, not individual poems, and I feel like they don't. A lot of them don't stand on their own.
Right.
And so at a reading, I'll pick a variety of different ones to read together. So, Tamar's got something.
Yeah, I'm happy to read a poem that I really like, and I think because it just reminds me of just a wonderful time when my husband and I went to Greece, and just looking out, we rented a lot of random places on Airbnb, or not Airbnb, but those hotel websites, and some of them were really nice and some of them not so nice. But this was a particularly beautiful one where we were kind of looking out the window at this ocean. It actually wasn't on Santorini, but one of the other smaller islands, Milos. And so I'm going to read that poem to close. Aegean Blue, Santorini. The clouds followed us down the coast, almost into ocean foam before leaving us, an island halfway between seawater and a cactus blooming. Brimming with imported water, we defied all odds, remembered life vests. And we also remembered stick shift, drove between dry and wet worlds through Arcosolia and Loculi, searching for permanence. Drove with all windows open, sucking in the pressure of salt, lifting wetness. Touched every tight curve, our heated wheels on burning asphalt. Earth behind us through quips at our departure. The souvenir shops had everything. Almonds and honey, postcards, the replicas of baklava or tiny churches. Calderas jutted out like overflowing breasts on busts of Greek gods, declaring independence from relentless blue. You took photos, I read out loud Wikipedia, excerpts from Homer, names of mountains, Emily and love forever. We felt like tourists, strange to each other suddenly. Peeling burnt skin, we found a pinkness, newer than whites and blues, our mythology.
Awesome. It's beautiful. Well, I think that we're just about at our time. I'd like to thank Signature Books and Karen Hyen for inviting me to host this super fun event, and to Ashley for calmly wrangling the technical part of the world. Angeline and Tamar, thank you both for your beautiful books. And Tamar, coming out of the gate so strong, I think you will have a stellar poetry career ahead of you.
I also just want to say a couple of thanks. I want to thank everyone who helped make tonight possible and make it such a wonderful success. Thank you to Lori for hosting this event, and to Angeline and Tamar for sharing your poetry with us. Just a reminder that if you want to buy copies of both Tablet Fragments as well as Fields of Light and Stone, you can do so. Those links are still pinned in the comments and they're in the description. So make sure that you do that. Thank you so much for joining us to celebrate tomorrow's launch of Tablet Fragments. I hope that you all have a wonderful night.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.